Keep clapping for a minute there because it's so good to have our friend Hannah Kirby with us too. And Hannah Kirby and her mom are here, and you know it's so nice because they come. It's a gift from her, but they come all the way over here from East Texas. And there's two things to think about that. First of all, they come from East Texas to be here. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that this service is happening here at First United Methodist in the reddest county in Texas. That's pretty amazing. We're in the South, we're in the Bible Belt, we're in the buckle of the Bible Belt, and this service, well, I'm going to talk about this in a minute, because I think we need to realize just how amazing this community of faith is right here. And that's what I hope we can start getting across as we start thinking of what it means to have a big mind in a small-minded world, and what we have an opportunity to mirror all the time to people around us. And we're doing it here every Sunday. So, anyway, I'm going to share with you a story. Now, I've told this story before. I think there's enough of you here that haven't heard the story, and it's a great illustration. It's been a while. So, in the early church's life, there's a story about the Jewish and the Christian community living side by side. They were living kind of in close proximity, and they seemed to get along for a while, even as the Christian community began to distinguish itself increasingly from the Jewish community. But there was at one point a time where finally some of the Christians got together and said, you know, there's really not enough room for both of us. I mean, our two communities were too different. We just need to split up here. We need to be who we are. They need to be who they are, and they are not us. And so they decided they would have to figure out some way to get the Christian community to move, and they would stay. And so they decided that they would call forth the elders of both communities, and the Jewish community came over, some of their leaders in the Christian community, and they decided that the fairest thing would be to have a debate of their wits, their intellect, and that the wisest, most intelligent, most insightful group could stay and the others would have to go. And so they agreed. And quickly, the Christian community got together. They've had a number of folks that they had been training carefully in the Christian faith. And Brother Andrew was one of the wisest and smartest, knew the elements, the very central themes of the Christian faith. And the Jewish community got back to their little village, and they were talking amongst each other, and they said, why did we agree to this? And we haven't had a rabbi in years. I mean, we just sort of fuddle around and make things happen, you know. But I don't know anyone that knows all of the great teachings of our faith. And finally, one of them said, you know, the chicken man, Yankel, he's pretty clever. He seems to know something. And Yankel said he was more than happy to go up head to head in a debate with whoever they brought forth. They said, well, we could do worse. So they brought him forward, and they had a debate. And it was supposed to be in sign language so that it would be fair, and it would clearly challenge the deeper wisdom. They wouldn't get all tied up in language and how confusing and tripped up we can get with language. And so Brother Andrew was the first to begin, and he held up his hand with 3 fingers. And Yankel looked at that a little confused at first, but then he smiled and held up 1 finger. Well, to that, Brother Andrew looked at his community as leaders, and he was a little surprised at this. And so he kind of got a serious, stern look, and he put his hand to his fist and then drew sort of an arch, a wide arch. Yankel saw that, got a little bit defiant, and then pleaded with his fist pounding into his hand. And at that, you could clearly see that Brother Andrew was stunned. At his last wits, he finally turned to an acolyte, a trainee in the faith, whispered something. The acolyte ran off to their chapel and quickly came back with the elements of their faith, the broken loaf of bread, the cup of wine, and he set them down on the table in front of Yankel. And Yankel looked kind of curiously at the elements and then whispered something to a friend who quickly brought back a small sack, and Yankel pulled out an apple and slammed it right next to the elements, and then sat back, rubbed his hands, and smiled. Brother Andrew threw up his hands, looked at his community, and said, we lost. They walked back to pack up, get ready to leave. The elders were looking at Brother Andrew and said, how could you lose to Yankel, the chicken man? And the Brother Andrew said, I'm still confused to this moment, but the man is wise beyond his appearance. He stumbled. He came back with the most wise responses to everything I told him. Stooped me at every turn. I told him that our God is the Holy Trinity. It's the very core of our faith, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He came back and saying, yes, but God is the one God. One God of all gods is one. So I said, fine. I said, but God spans space and time. And he came back and said, but God is a very real present. And so I did the only thing I knew what to do. I took out the elements to remind him that we are broken. Our community is brokenness for one another. And he came back and reminded me, yes, but we are all sinners. We all are fallible. We are all mortal. And he slammed down the apple. I couldn't come up with anything to beat him. So they were packing up. Meanwhile, Yankel was, they were cheering. They were throwing him up in the air. They set him down. And they said, what in the world did you say to beat this guy? And Yankel says, I still don't know. He says, I don't understand at all. He said, first of all, Brother Andrew looked at me and he said, you have 3 days to get out of town. And I looked at him and said, never mind, we'll go in one. And then he got really strange and said that we don't have to leave that far. If we wanted to, we could go from here and just move over there. And I said, never mind, there's room for both of us right here. Then he did the strangest thing. He brought out his lunch and I brought out mine. So a couple of things to say quickly in relation to that story. First of all, this idea of big minds is a big way of seeing, and yet it is rooted in a very simple present awareness, an attentiveness to one another. And that's the challenge. This idea of having a wide open mind that is in fact rooted in the moment. That's the challenge, I think, for us, especially as people who think dualistically, right? Who think in terms of either or, who think in terms of yes, of no, but, who think in terms of black and white, who think in terms of fight or flight. I mean, it's challenging for us to think more in terms of just being present and seeing what happens by trying to let go of all of those preconceptions and all of those assumptions. That's the first thing. The second thing is that Thomas Merton once said, and it was very surprising to the Christian community. Thomas Merton is a Jesuit monk who died back in the early 2000s. And Thomas Merton, or no, I'm sorry, he died in the 70s. But Thomas Merton was a monk who said that the Catholic Church, he was teaching a group of Catholic priests, and he said the Catholic Church has had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of monastic settlements, of monks of different divisions and orders, and nuns of different divisions and orders. And he said, and yet not one of them, maybe one, maybe two, he said, has truly figured out what contemplation is. And the priests were stunned that he would say such a thing, because that's the whole point of their order, to be in prayer, to be in times of service, to be in contemplation. And he says, no, rather what they've done is they've created a whole civilization of introverts. What an idea. Because what really was going on for contemplation for most of these people was something that Thomas Merton realized they had forgotten, or they had lost from the earliest days of the Christian faith, or they simply were misdirected by their own biology, and that was that they were thinking dualistically, that their prayers were always directed outwards rather than inward. Richard Rohr says that the problem with most of us, Christian, Buddhist, most faiths, the problem with our dualistic mind is that we have forgotten how to see. We don't know how to see things. That is in fact what contemplation means. It is a way of seeing things as they are. Contemplatar means to see. And the challenge of seeing things as the way they are is the fact that people typically don't see things as the way they are. What they typically see is things as the way they are. We don't typically see things as the way they are. We typically see things as the way we are. And so what we see naturally becomes a progression of who we are, our background, our culture, our enculturation, our training, our childhood faith development, our tribal orientations, our comfort zones. We tend to see things as we are. Justin, can you throw up the picture? I saw this cartoon recently. Oh, Lord, I would like to see the whole world saved. Oh, thanks. What is it with which we see through to see the world? The wonderful thing that's in this text that I think that we have for today is two things. First of all, I love how it says Philip came and two disciples came and they said, I want to see Jesus. It begins with this idea of I want to see. I want to see. What are they going to see when they see Jesus? They don't even know what they've got there, right? I mean, that remains a conflict for the early Christian church. Who was this, in fact? You know, even the earliest church began debating after his death. Was he just spirit? Was he actually here? Was he actually physical presence? You see it in the earliest creeds where they try to deal with this whole diversity of thinking. They say Jesus was human. Jesus was human of human born, but not human born. Born of spirit, yet born of flesh. They kind of tried to keep both things in there because it was so complicated trying to understand just who this was for their time. How we see is often how we are. And that's the challenge, I think. The task for Big Mind is a matter of getting out of this dualistic way of thinking. And this is going to be the heart of the question of the things that I want to address during this series, having Big Mind help for a small-minded reality. This idea of this is how we do it. Because I think in the Western world, more than anything, I think we have this crisis of seeing, of how we see. And so what we tend to see is our defensiveness, or we tend to see in relation to our defensiveness. We tend to see in relation to our anxieties. We tend to see in relation to our doubts or our shame or our guilt. We tend to see in those things. And this text that we have from the Gospel of John is this amazing text that says, in order to live, you have to die. In order to find, you have to lose. Something has to be let go of. Richard Rohr often says that it's difficult for many of us to get there for a couple of reasons. One major reason is because neurologically, we're designed around our neural pathways, right? Our brain operates out of neural pathways. And these neural pathways have been designed, malleolated, grooved, however you want to think of it, over time from childhood into young adulthood. But here's what happens by the time we get to older adulthood. Some of those pathways have fallen away to disuse. And do you know why that is? Because we're lizard brains. We operate mostly out of the amygdala. We operate mostly out of our responsiveness to these anxieties. Wanting to fit in, wanting to be successful. All of these images and ideals that were handed to us, we try to live them out faithfully, and yet we get lost in these singular grooves toward those ends. And such that at some point, by the time we get into our 50s or 60s, we no longer have hundreds of these neural pathways. We have 4 or 5, which is why we start getting really boring. We haven't got we tend to, or why we sometimes tend to think the exact same way all of the time. The good news is, of course, that we're not limited to those neural pathways. The bad news is that it's really hard to change them. It's really hard to create these new pathways of thinking, which is why mindfulness has become such a popular technique now, a popular practice. Because in mindfulness, we begin to practice being more present to the moment and working from that place. We begin to practice letting go of our thoughts, reminding ourselves that's all they are. They are like illusions almost. They're really not there. They're just part of this pattern that we have allowed ourselves to fall into over time. And through this practice of paying attention to these moments, to these encounters, asking the questions, being curious, through those processes and entering into uncomfortable scenarios, we begin to open up something new. We begin to see new things. But let's see the second picture up here, Justin. Be careful which one you pick. You'll be in it for the rest of your life. It's a challenge, right? It's a challenge getting out of these boxes that we create. These neural patterns, if you want to look at them biologically, but if you think about them emotionally and experientially, they're the patterns we grow up with, and it's a challenge to think outside those patterns. And it's where we are politically and socially and theologically, especially those of us in our 40s, 50s, and 60s, because again, we have the most time spent digging those neurological grooves. So that even maybe we've opened our box a little bit, but we're still inside the box. So for example, if I say that the real goal of faith is to have the eyes of God, to see with the eyes of God, already you're going to familiar places. Some of you are already going to a familiar place of, I think I know what he's talking about God. We're going to have those eyes of love and compassion and inclusiveness, and that God who is out there, but still who's trying to encourage us to be the best we can be. But we still have this dualistic kind of comfort zone with the God who's kind of removed from us. And then some of you are going to that place where you're going, oh no, he's talking about God again. And I don't know why he starts talking about God. The minute he starts talking about God, I start thinking about the church I grew up in. I start thinking about the judgmental, shameful kind of way they treated me, how I didn't fit in that church. And some of you will go to that place. And some of you who are truly, and I know there's some of you who are atheists in here, and you'll say, I don't even know why I'm sitting here because he's talking about God again. And what I want to encourage you is that you're all wrong. You're all wrong, because we're back in our grooves again, right? That's not big mind thinking, that's box thinking. And the challenge for faith, the challenge for spirituality is to get out of box thinking into big mind thinking. And the way to do that is to begin to let go of those things, to begin to ask questions of those things, to challenge us in moments of encounter that are uncomfortable, even politically with others. I remember my father-in-law, my mother married a second time after 40 years of being divorced. She remarried, many of you knew about this. She married Brad Bradley, a colonel and in the Air Force, retired. He was 91, she was 88. It was a beautiful ceremony. We had it over in the chapel. A number of you were there. It was a wonderful story. My mom had had a stroke a year or two before. She had been incapacitated, paralyzed from the waist down, and we basically figured that was the end of her, that was going to be the end of her days. She would kind of live out her days there in rehab. And then she started telling us about this guy that was visiting her, right? And that she had a new boyfriend, and we were going like, oh my God, and she's lost her mind too. So we just knew that this whole thing was fabricated, until one day we walk in, Linda and I walk in, and there's this tall gentleman talking to her, and we look at each other like, that must be the colonel, And sure enough, he proposed to her. He asked us. It was very sweet. All of it was very sweet. A beautiful, lovely man. Just amazing man. Tall, just forthright, and just kind of a determined individual, even at 91. And my mother decided, she was inspired by his motivation and energy, and she decided she'd walk. And so she actually walked down the aisle. She actually regained her strength, had a purpose. Who knows what it was? But she had this new purpose, and so she walked with my brothers on either side. Linda and I did the ceremony. Beautiful ceremony. And it was a wonderful relationship. We loved Brad. One day we were sitting down at Mexican food with Brad at one of the restaurants here in town. He and my mother, Linda, and I were sitting there. And it was about 6 years ago. Now, they're both deceased now for a couple of years, but it was about 6 years or so ago. And Brad was sitting there talking, and something came up about politics. And Brad just kind of was saying something, and Linda looked over and said, well, we voted for Obama, and the plate slammed on the table, and he backed away from the table in stunned expression, and just stared. I'll never forget what he said. I thought you were smart. And he was befuddled. He didn't know how to deal with it. And I understand his difficulty. I couldn't deal with him either. But that's not the point, is it? That's not the point. The point was quickly we had to get back to a place where we could relate, where we could begin to converse with one another again. And it took some doing, because his groove, his neural pathway just went, come on in, this is the safe place. And that's exactly where he went. And the walls came up, and it was difficult to communicate because he went right there to that place. It's so hard not to go there. But over time, we began to talk about other things, remembering what it was that we were all passionate about, our love of family, our love of our family, of our mother, and his love of our mother, and just our joys at other things that we shared in common. Politics never did become a very comfortable thing. But I'll never forget, a few months before he died, we were talking with each other, and I never forget how he had said to us, he said, "You aren't as stupid as I thought you were." I'll take it. We smiled and said, "You're still as smart as we thought you were." We just left it at that. It's such a challenge to get past these comfort zones and get past these boxes. And yet, we're anxious about stuff, about language. We're anxious simply because of our neurology. We want to say it's because of our teachings and because of what we learned. But it's largely related to our neurology, our emotions, our affects, our biological emotions. These things govern so much that we have to learn to retrain. Having a big mind doesn't just come by saying, "I'm open-minded." I've been with some of you. You're not that open-minded. But I'm not either sometimes. I can be really obsessive-compulsive about things. And I can be very negative. I've told you my business card says on there, associate minister, but underneath it, it says creative irritant. And it's not because I'm creative. I'm irritating. Just ask anybody I work with. The first thing they'll say is, "I've got an idea." I say, "It won't work." I'll cut it down just so we can see if it actually will stand up. This idea of getting into these open-minded, to these bigger-minded views of the world is so challenging. And yet, the promise is, as Jesus would say, the promise is the kingdom, right? That's the kingdom. The promise is the kingdom, the connectedness of God in our midst, the connectedness of the ground of our being, the connectedness that we have with one another. We don't get there by finding ways of divisiveness. We get there by trying to find connections. That's the only way we get there. And the only way we can get to that place is by trying to practice these ways of opening not just our mind, but of letting go of our defenses. That's the challenge. Anthony DeMello was a Jesuit storyteller, and he died in 98. When I was in the storytelling world traveling around, I went to a workshop, and he was there. He's got a number of storytelling books, and he was there giving a talk. He told this story. He said, "There was once a guru who was leading worship at an ashram. And the guru had a cat. Now, as they were worshiping, this cat would come in and start purring and rubbing up against the worshipers who were in meditation, disrupting their mindlessness, and their meditation. And so finally, he said, the guru decided to tie the cat up to a post outside in another room. So during worship, the cat would be tied up. Now, that practice went on for years, as long as the guru was there and the cat was there for a number of years. Well, after the guru died, another guru came in. They continued to tie the cat to the post. When the cat died, they got another cat and tied it to the post. Years and years later, as people began to write about the teachings of this master, the original guru, they began to talk about the importance of the ritual of tying a cat to a post outside while you worship. Now, that's the story. That's where it ended. After his death, about 10 years after his death, his own diocese, which was in India, his own area, the archbishop of that area, filed formal charges against Anthony DeMello, condemning him for his teachings, because he said his teachings were too human. And they didn't specify specifically enough the teachings of the church, but instead left it to feel as if Jesus might be more human than divine, and that any one of us could access God in the same way through these simple-minded stories. And that was adopted by his diocese. And he was condemned posthumously. Jesus' own parables were meant to disrupt. Simple parables that said, if you die to yourself, you will find life. If you lose yourself, you will find yourself. Laborers of the vineyard. Okay, so everyone agrees to what they're going to get paid. The one who comes in at the very end, works an hour, gets paid the same as everybody else. It didn't make sense. It was paradoxical. It was meant to leave you thinking and opening up your mind about things. Let's see the next picture real quick. Believing was so much easier before I started thinking. And that's the challenge. The challenge for us is to think about what we're thinking, is to challenge our thinking, to see a bigger picture. And we can do it, and we're going to talk about ways we can do it throughout this series, ways in which we can begin to challenge our neurological sort of pathways, in ways in which we can practice an openness towards one another that is less about simply tolerating and is more about seeing, and this is the challenge, more about seeing you and me as the same. That's the challenge. It's one thing for me to say, I can tolerate your conservative views. You can tolerate my liberal perspective. I'll tolerate it. That's not what this is all about at all. This is about letting go of all of that to find out how we are connected. Let's see this last picture. It's one of my favorite pictures. I love this picture. Atheist on one hill, believer on the other hill, and underneath the water, they're both connected. It's easy for us to say they're not. It's easy for us to say, you don't think like I do, so we're not the same. But at the ground of all things, what Jeremiah was saying is that this is no longer a covenant of you people, and I'm going to be your God as long as you are my specific people. Everybody is going to have it written on their hearts. Everybody. No longer do you need to apologize or be forgiven. Everybody has it written on their hearts. We are all connected. And Jesus says the only way to get there is by learning to let go of the other stuff. Amen.